All right, hello, welcome to the Game Development Group. This is our very first Unity workshop. My name is Liz. I'm the director or president of the group. Usually we have a Unity workshop coordinator, Mert, who's out sick today. Okay, and you are?
I'm a student.
You're Pavel, the vice director of the club, who's here to help out. Yes. Anyway, so he's here to help out for folks. So you can just raise your hand throughout the workshop. You guys. So if you have any questions, he'll be kind of here to help out, especially with installation because it's kind of dependent on your setup. But yes, I'm Liz. I'm subbing in for Mert. So the following is hopefully Mert will feel better, and then he will be hosting. But I'm subbing in today, so you have to deal with me. But I just want you guys give you a heads up that this is an absolute beginner workshop. So for folks that have done Unity before, we're going to be covering installing it, setting up your first project. We're going to cover navigating the Unity Hub and the editor, all the different little UI elements and components that it holds. I'm going to be covering the structure of it. Then we'll dive a little bit into very basic scripting and kind of understanding how all that works and kind of covering components and color changing and stuff like that. So if that sounds all familiar to you, if any of you have used Unity before, I don't want you to be bored for the next hour. So feel free to dip whenever you want, or just leave, or just stay and stick around and do stuff, up to you. But just want to give you guys a heads up. So I'm actually curious, has anybody here used Unity before? I know you've used Unity before. Has anybody has any programming experience? Okay, a good chunk. And what about, have anybody here programmed in either C# or Java? Okay, awesome. All right, so a decent mixture, so that will be helpful. Because I know Binghamton in the computer science program focuses on C and C++, so this will be a little bit different. But no worries, we will go over for absolute beginners, so if something sounds boring to you, I apologize, but I want everybody to be on the same page. So, basically the first step is to install Unity, and we're going to go over that at the very beginning because it takes the longest out of all the entries we cover. So, has anybody here not installed Unity yet? Okay, so I'll go over that. But awesome, so the folks that have, that's awesome. So you can scan this QR code, or I should have given you a link. You can actually probably look it up. Here, let's do that.
Is there a way to update Unity? I have Unity. It's not, it's from 2017 apparently.
As in if you go here, your install says 2017. That should be fine. If you want, you can install the latest one. It's up to you, just because 2017 is quite a while ago, so maybe there's major updates. But I would say we're covering the basics, so it's kind of it's probably the same since 2017. For this installation guide, you could scan this QR code. It's a guide that I made last semester. Or I was going to give you guys a link for the folks that are on PC. But you can look up, sorry, if you go to GitHub, this is terrible. I should have given you guys a tiny URL. But if you go to GitHub, and then, actually, let's just look up GitHub, and then you type this, if you look that up, that's my name, and that's me. Yes?
I think it's in the email you sent us.
That is true. If you guys are in the Discord or in the email, it's also in there, because I linked it. But if you don't have it, you just look up GitHub, and then my name. The installation guide that I made last semester, it's linked in either the Discord or the email that I attached, that I've follow these.
I just started.
Yeah, it's just kind of this here. If you go to repositories, I just made a guide last semester where you can go to installing Unity, and then this kind of covers, because you have to register for Unity, and then basically you just download the hub and then download the latest, if it prompts you, the latest long-term support. And then you download Visual Studio, documentation, and then your build support for your computer if you want to export games right now. And then you got to sign in and so on. Hopefully it's self-explanatory. But if anybody needs help getting here, let me know. Pavel, you got all this? How to find it? Go look this up, and you find my repo. You've used GitHub, right? Okay, awesome. All right, so I want you guys to start getting that installed right now because it does take a bit. But for the folks that have it already installed, I'll be going over some fun slides. All right. Is everybody on this in the process of, for the folks that haven't, you were able to find it? It's just registration and then downloading the latest version. If you have if you have an old version, that's fine. It's usually not a big difference. Okay. So, just a little introduction of what Unity is. So obviously, it's a game engine, but it's a cross-platform game engine. It's developed by Unity Technologies, so it's like a private one. It's not open source. But the biggest draw to it is cross-platform. So it develops both for Mac, Windows, Linux, Android, iOS, Xbox, PlayStations, VR headsets, AR. Well, I mean, that's mobile, I guess, but AR it does as well. It has both 2D and 3D and VR and AR. So it's got a whole bunch of stuff, which is why it's pretty dope, pretty nice. And then it's like if you are a professional developer, you just kind of pay once, I believe, or you pay yearly or something, and then you can export to all of those and publish your game, which is really nice. I guess some fun facts is that the engine itself is developed in C++, like a lot of game development is done. So if you're interested in professional game development for some reason, just fun fact, learn C++. But the stuff that we'll be using to actually code our objects inside of the engine is C#. So C# is very similar to Java. It's object-oriented, which makes sense for Unity and also game development in general, because we have objects and then we want to have our little programs that we're going to script attached to those objects that do things according to where those objects are located, for example, which is different from something like Python or C, where you have like a code that runs from top to bottom, right? Just a little bit of introduction. So C# is C-based, as the name suggests, but it's got some similarities, I would say, mostly to Java. But if you know any programming language, like once you learn one, you kind of can learn others, I would say. But yeah, but most similar to Java, I would say. And then, again, another fun fact is it's better than Python, but slower than C and C++. C++ is great. That's why it's used in game development. So like Unreal uses C++. I'm rambling. Okay. Pros and cons, if you're interested, but you're here, so I would recommend to use it. But I would say C# is pretty easy to learn, like especially if you've had some programming knowledge, or even if you don't have any, like there's so many tutorials online, I'll link some at the end, that you can, and it has similar to other languages, to learn that, because it's also in Unity, it hides so much stuff for you. So Unity is pretty cool. It's really chunky, but it's cool because it hides so much stuff from you. So you just program your specific object, and then the engine does the rest for you, which is pretty cool. It's good, as I mentioned, for all these platforms, but VR and AR is another plus. So it's like other game engines, like other 2D engines or other 3D engines might not have that support. And again, both 2D and 3D. So we focus on 2D. I think the whole semester will be doing 2D, maybe 1 or 2 3D at the end. We'll see, just because it's easier to work and program 2 dimensions before you do 3 dimensions. But obviously, if you know Unity and you learn 2D, then in the future, you already know how everything works. So boom, you just slap another dimension in there and you're ready to go. I mean, there's other stuff, but you know. Some cons I would personally say is, like, one of them is, for example, it takes so long to install and to set up because it's pretty large. So it's kind of like a double-edged sword. It has so much support for so many platforms, but then it takes a while to compile and to run your game. So for example, on my Mac, you might see later, anytime I make one script change and I save, I have to wait like 10 seconds for it to compile everything. So it's kind of like just slows down and kind of can get frustrating a little bit. It takes a decent amount to just set up the project with all the like files and stuff. And this con, I would say, is like dependent on your perspective. So it doesn't give you 100% control, but like if you're a beginner, then it's good because you don't want 100% control because that would be way too much. But if you want more finicky control, like for example, I've seen people use Godot, especially after this recent drama. People have been switching to Godot, which gives you nice control over your game. So if you're just interested, I'm just throwing out a bunch of keywords. And yeah, the biggest one recently is like they tried to change their pricing and like screw everybody over, and everyone's like, no. And then the CEO resigned, and then they redid everything, and then they were like, sorry. But then now people are like, we don't trust Unity. So it's kind of like when I tell people, oh, we're going to run Unity, they're like, are you sure about that? I'm like, well, if you're not selling your games, I think it's fine. Which, you know, I don't think you guys will, but who knows, I will support you. And then some games made in Unity that you might know about, which is pretty cool. I think one cool is Genshin because it's huge. It's open world, so all these open world maps are, lots of technical aspects that you have to consider. But as you could tell from this selection, there's way more, but I'm just chose some popular ones. Like, it's very versatile, you know what I mean? Like, all these look completely different, but they're all made in one engine, so that's really cool, I think. And so that's why it's like Unity is the type of engine that's great for beginners, and also professional companies use it, which is why I think it's a great tool to have to learn for game development, and also, again, if you're going for a career, it's awesome on your resume. Okay. All right, so I want to jump into the hub and the editor. So I'm going to be switching, mostly now I'll be like just kind of sharing my screen and showing you guys stuff. But is everybody has people for downloads? Are we downloading it, installing it, setting it up? Fail to install?
Yeah. Wi-Fi here is very slow, I think.
Fabella, can you help them out?
Yeah.
Yes, it will take a while to install, so hopefully maybe by the end of the workshop you guys can kind of jump in with us. But at the very beginning right now, I'll jump into the editor, but I'll just be explaining a whole bunch of stuff. Okay. Or actually, for folks who have it installed, let's do this. If it's hard to see, let me know, and I'll take a break from yapping and I'll figure it out. But basically you have your hub. This is your hub. So this is what like Unity first comes installed with, and then it prompts you to install your first like editor version automatically. But if you check what you have, like I think it defaults to projects, the project tab. To check if you have an editor installed, you just go to installs. So for me personally, I have 2022.3.12 and then 0.3.9. So I probably have an older version compared to you guys, but it's a couple months old. It doesn't really matter. So some fun stuff is you can check which modules you have installed. If you click this little gear icon on the right, add modules. So for example, I know that this has Mac, WebGL, and Windows installed. As in, what build support means is I can export my game on Mac, on WebGL, and on Windows. That's why I recommend you downloading the one that you have. So if you have a Mac, download Mac build support and so on. So you can modify your installs there, or you can completely add an editor. But again, you just need the one. You don't even need a build support right now. But once you have it installed, we're going to create a project. So again, I told you we're going to be doing 2D. So I'm going to have you guys do that for now, because it takes a hot second to also set up. Another downside. But I'll be yapping while you guys have that running. So you just click new project, and then we have 2D core as like a template. Hopefully you guys have these templates. And then you just can name it, all your settings on the right here. I'm going to name it like workshop 1. And then I have a folder there. And I'm not going to connect it to Unity Cloud or use the version control. These are new features. I guess Unity Cloud is like a Google Drive for your projects. I don't care, so I'm not going to do that. Okay, so just 2D project, the template. It's pretty important you select it because, again, there's so many libraries. If you accidentally select, for example, 2D mobile, it might have completely different installations that won't work for you, for what we're trying to do. So I would recommend doing that. And then you just hit create project, and it's going to have this lovely little image that pops up for like 5 minutes, probably. Or it'll just be here. Anyway. Oh, that one. Yeah. So that'll be there for like a while. So I want you guys to just have that set up for now. And while that's loading, this is just the hub, right? And obviously, this project will open in the editor. But before we kind of get into that, I want to just go over the overall structure that Unity uses for all its projects, right? So I have this cute little diagram here. So obviously, we just created our template project. It's going to create one from scratch. So your project is going to be the main folder, like you can find it on your computer, obviously. The main folder that has everything. So it's all the Unity pre-installed libraries and all of your assets, all your scripts, all your images, all your audio, so on and so forth. So that's what your project houses, right? All of the files. If you delete your project folder, you delete your project. Makes sense. But inside of that project, maybe, oops. Oh, what's happening? Is mine done? Oh, okay. This kind of sucks, but inside of that project we have scenes, okay? So this is just kind of be like a little Matryoshka vibe, but like we have our project, and each project has multiple scenes, right? And a scene is basically a level. So inside of our editor, maybe, yeah, I will do that. I'll jump back and forth. For now, it's really small, but yeah, this is like your little viewport. This is where your little things are. But I suppose for scenes, I'll probably be jumping back and forth between between this diagram and then all of these panels. Because this is the default view, I believe. Yeah. And so you have a bunch of stuff on your screen, and you're like, what the hell's going on? I don't know what's happening. Yeah. And let's see. Let's see. Yeah. Okay. Just a quick checkup. Everybody's fine. Any questions so far? Okay. So, we have our UI here. So let's go from the top left and just kind of go like that. But we have here. It's all these are like little tabs. I don't know if you guys can read it. Yeah, what's up?
Is it possible to dim the lights?
Yeah. I can try to turn them on like that. That's better. Okay. I know it's like the text is small, and I know there's a way I can make this bigger by making my Mac screen smaller, but I can try and do that when we walk around and help you guys. So each tab has this little like thing that with a name, so you can hopefully see hierarchy all the way up here. It's really small, but hierarchy is your scene, as you can see. So remember, we have our project here. This is my project. I mean, it says project right here, right? And that's all my files right here. And then we have our scenes. So right now, it defaults to sample scene. So anytime you have a brand new project, we have a brand new scene. And the only folder that we have with our files is our scenes folder, right? So this is the level that we have open right now. And I can click this little drop-down arrow to see all the things that are inside of it. Right now, we just have a camera, right? Which is this in the middle of our screen here. So the hierarchy is where all of your objects will be, right? So kind of because it's relevant, I'll jump back into this. Each scene that we have, right? We have our project, which is the whole thing. We have our sample scene open, and each scene, right, has a bunch of game objects inside of it, and they're capitalized like this, right, inside of the code. So in this sample scene, we just have one game object, the main camera. It has this little box icon, and we can create our own game objects, and we'll kind of play around with that. After I introduce all the panels. As I mentioned, this up here says scene. It's self-explanatory. It's the scene view. So we're working in 2D, so this is a two-dimensional plane. As a little fun fact, it's just very well hidden. It's actually 3D, but they hide it because you just press this little 2D button, and then boom, it's 2D. Pretty magical. But you shouldn't ever touch that, otherwise you'll be like, what's happening? But this is our scene view. So we have our, I forget what it is. Oops, no. So we have a bunch of little tools here. So the little hand just gives you ability to drag around. This lets you move things around, right? So if I can click on an object and see this little like, this just lets me pan, but this lets me move the objects, right? So this yellow is your y-axis, this red is your x-axis, and then this little blue square just lets you click and drag around. What's up?
Like a move shortcut?
Yeah, I think so, because I believe there's like a multi-tool. I usually don't use this. It depends on if you're on Mac or Windows, your like little shortcuts. I would recommend just looking it up. You can just look up like Unity shortcuts for switching between tools or something like that, because I never memorize it. I also never use a trackpad to develop because that's hell. But I think there's like this like multi-tool which you can do like rotations and scaling and moving it all at the same time. So see, like, this is just moving it. This little tool is rotating it, right? This little tool is scaling it. So see when you have little squares, it's a camera, so you actually can't. Maybe I'll let you guys play around with something when we create it, and you'll see how like it changes. But this lets you, I don't even know what this does. I honestly don't know what that does. And this is the transform. Transform just includes rotation, scaling, and transformation, or translating. I usually use the little pan tool. So that's the scene. There's a bunch of stuff up here, and to be honest, I don't ever touch this. So that's like the one thing. So like I know this kind of has to do with like your 3D rendering stuff. There's like your grid here, so if you accidentally turn it off, it's like right there. I mean, you can play around with this if you'd like. I just don't touch it, personally. The other tab up here is the game window, right? So this is actually, so the scene is like your level editor, and your game is what your game will look like. So right now, we just have the camera. And so if I, also at the top, we have this play button. If I play my game right now, well, I don't have anything happening, so it's just gonna showcase nothing. But as you see, I pressed play to play test my game, and it switches automatically to the game view, which is really nice. So you don't have to manually do it, but you can do so if you want to see like where your camera's positioned, without play testing your game. Then on the right side there, we have our inspector. So if I click on, actually jumping back to this, it's related because every game object has components. So this is the full diagram of our project, right? Scenes, my sample scene. I have, for example, right now, I'll select my camera, my main camera game object. And all your game objects have components, right? And this is just, this is how it works. Like this is how Unity works. Your scripts are components. Anything you want to, if you want to add audio or sprites, it's just components. Everything is a game object, right? So to jump back into Unity, to see those components, I select in my hierarchy. So we'll see how it's blue now. I select one game object. So I selected the camera. And you see here, a bunch of stuff pops up. And you see, like, has a little icon and a name. I can just collapse these. And see, it has 3 components: the transform, the camera, and the listener. So by default, the main camera is listening to any audio that you have. And there's a separate component to play audio called audio source, if you're curious. And as you can see, like, there's a bunch of settings that come with it if you like open it up. So for example, see this background color in our game? Like, if you want, you can change it to be a different color, right? If you feel like it. You can change the size and stuff like that. The most I play with is like size. We won't touch the camera today, and I wouldn't recommend for you to touch the camera because if you play around with it too much, you could just break everything, and that's not fun. But you can change the color if you'd like. But as you can see, it's like that component. The one component that every game object will have is the transform, because the transform holds, the most important one is the position of the object, right? So like you can't really have an object without a position, and if you do want to have an object that just kind of exists, it'll still be a transform. It'll still exist somewhere in your scene in some position. It just won't be visible. So like sometimes you might have like manager objects that like just run a script and that's it, but they will still have a transform. So every object has this, right? So for folks, if you were able to, actually no, I didn't finish my tutorial. Here, by the way, you can, in the very top right, you can select your layout if you want and like save it. Like let's say you like this one for some reason, you can play around with that. Like maybe that's if you're like 3D modeling, I don't know. I just use the default. And then in the bottom we have our project tab and our console tab. So project is what the project is. So as you can see here, we have packages and assets. So packages, you can play around with it, you can look at it if you want. These are all the stuff that Unity pre-installs for you. So these are all the default libraries. So let's see, this one's like 2D animation, 2D sprites, 2D pixels, stuff like that, 2D tile maps. So if you chose the wrong template, these won't be there, and that's why everything will kind of break. But these I don't ever play with them, I don't ever touch them, right? Unless you are like some professional and know what you're doing, you typically don't touch them. Your assets is where all your stuff is. So right now we just have our scenes object. But like, for example, let's say I have images that I want my characters to be. Those are going to be called sprites, right? So I can create a folder, or I can also click on this plus, for example, create a folder. I'll call it sprites, and then I can go into it and place all my images there for my character artwork, for example, right? So your assets will, over the course of you building your project, will get larger and larger. And I would recommend, creating all your folders and organizing all your stuff. And then, yeah, so let's see. How many folks have a project like this open? Okay, and everybody else is, what is it, are you guys installing or you're still installing? Yeah, I'm so sorry. But I'm glad that most of you have it, which means that our push to have it beforehand is good. We'll try that next semester too. But let's see. Yeah. If you guys want to, we'll just take a little quick break and you guys can play around with some stuff. But if you, in this hierarchy view, I want you guys to play around with by creating some objects and some components and just see what Unity has. There's so much that Unity has that I don't even know about because I just kind of follow tutorials and then they tell me what to do. But there's probably a lot that you could do. So how you can create a game object is, for example, you click this plus button, or you can also right click in the hierarchy and it's like right at the bottom as well. But there's a bunch. Create empty. There's 2D, 3D. I wouldn't create a 3D object in our 2D project, but you probably can. There's a particle system. You can play around with that if you guys are curious. So for example, boom, there's particles happening. And then that's pretty awesome. You can play around with that if you want, right? There's a lot of settings for this, but I want you guys to kind of play around with it, right? So for example, particle system, or very simple 2D object sprites, square. Boom. Square, Blender cube, but square, right? And the one thing I want to point out that's very valuable is that this, right, this looks very different from the square, but if you look at my inspector on the right side, like, it looks very similar. The particle system has a transform and a particle system component. That's kind of what makes it a particle system. But your square has a transform and a renderer, a sprite renderer. You'll see this pretty often for, like, if you want any characters. Any artwork in the game will need a sprite renderer, right? So for example, I can change my color here if you want, right? Boom, now it's a blue square. And I can make it bigger by going to my transform and, changing my scale, right? And I can kind of play around. Now it looks very different. And this lovely button entices you to add components. And there's a lot of them, like all those cool ones. There's like a bunch of stuff that I don't even know what this is. But I want to just take a little break. You guys can play around with stuff. We'll check in with everybody. I would recommend for you guys to just check out what game objects exist, what components exist, and I will leave this to you. It's always game objects. It's all game objects. All right. All right, does anybody here have Visual Studio before installing Unity? Okay, so I know you had it, because I'm sure if you're CS students, you might have had it. So basically, if you install Visual Studio through Unity, when you added your, what I mean by that is when you installed it, you checked off the top here, Visual Studio. If you did that when you installed your installer, you're good to go. If you had Visual Studio beforehand, you have to add the module for game development through it. So I believe if you have a Mac, you would go through Visual Studio extensions. Maybe that's the same for Windows or Linux. And basically you want to browse and hit the one that says game development. I already have it installed, so it'll say Visual Studio for Unity. Visual Studio tools. Let me see. Visual Studio. Okay. Oh yeah, this is the settings if you have Windows. I don't have a Windows. You click. You have to open the installer. and then you modify your installation through the installer, and you select this chunk. Yeah. Yeah. So if you follow that, then you're good to go.
I just made it so it would rotate.
But everybody else has Visual Studio through Unity, hopefully?
Still making a project that's on here.
Well, thankfully for Visual Studio, it's like a separate tool than Unity project, so it'll be able to set up your project just fine. And also Visual Studio is installed, it just won't have all the like autofill stuff. But if it's still setting up, try doing that.
Yeah, I'm gonna try doing this now.
And then I will switch back to the workshop.
I don't do skating on Steam.
Actually, it shouldn't affect necessarily.
All right. Has most folks have been able to set up a project and get their editor running?
Yeah, it's just what you call it's just still on the package. Just once this is done, then I see it.
All right, cool. Then I will give you some more time.
Oh, your camera is tilted. You changed the rotation of the camera. Oh, okay. Yeah, if you just get out of play mode, because you can't necessarily say anything. Just press. Yeah, just press out.
All right, I want to jump back into this. And I'll talk a little bit more, and then hopefully we could do some stuff like some basic scripting and get you guys accustomed to all the different aspects. So, one thing I just want you guys to know for sure is that your Visual Studio or whatever editor you're using is linked up correctly, which it should. But to double check, can you go to Edit and never mind, or Edit Project Settings? Am I crazy? Hold on. Editor? Whoa, edit. Preferences. Where's preferences? Settings? Okay. It's either edit and then you'll see preferences, or it'll be Unity settings. So whichever one says preferences or settings. And then it'll be a little tab called external tools. And just make sure that your external script editor is Visual Studio. Right? So if it says something else, make sure it says Visual Studio, that's the one that we're using, and the one that we will have set up. Which, if you did a fresh install, you should be good to go. Okay, so jumping back into this. Last one I think I did not talk about, I forgot, is the console. And all this does is I will show you guys, but when we have like debug statements, so when we're printing stuff from our code, or if there's any game breaking errors, they will show up in your console. So you can swap to that and check those out. But what I want to do is one final note about the camera is this Z aspect. So I guess the one final thing is, in terms of the 2D game stuff, is that everything is still technically programmed as if it's in 3D. And so for us, Z would be in a way of like your layers, right? So it's kind of like your higher Z number will be further in and your lower Z numbers will be closer to the camera. So by having our Z value for our camera be -10, like just don't change it if something is not visible anymore, just make sure it's a negative number. That way our camera is in front of everything. Typically you have like a Z value of like 0, right? And you usually don't want to mess with it because there's other ways to layer things. But just I wanted to cover that in case you guys are confused. It's like, why is there Z values? We don't usually touch those. But let's see. So there's a bunch of stuff you guys could play around with. I will get rid of these though. Goodbye. We don't want them. And then I want to essentially go through the process of our beginning a very simple script and having a little simple thing that moves around based on input, right? Because it's not a game if it doesn't react to what you do. So I want you guys to, you can create an empty object. I'm going to call it the player. And then I'm also going to just go and like find an image for my player. I'm going to be Kirby. This is kind of terrifying. I'm going to be this Kirby, actually. So I'm going to save the image Kirby. And then you can just drag and drop it. So basically you can just find like a little player character. So actually I'm going to open up my sprites folder. And the reason why they're called sprites is like there's like lore. It's like back in the day, the images for the players would kind of hover over the background like fairies, and so that's why they're called sprites. I don't know, but that's where the word comes from if you're curious. And actually, I think I can just do this, or maybe not. Maybe I lied. You import your image into your assets, and you can just drag and drop it into your scene. So I'm gonna actually do that instead of making the empty game object. I always mess this up, but it's easier this way because now it's like not squashed or stretched weirdly. What's up?
You could just add a sprite render component and then
Die.
that's why you.
Yes, because you could do that too. Sprite render. And then that too. There's two ways. You can either drag the sprite directly, because then this guy has a sprite render attached, or you create a fresh new game object that's empty, and then you add the sprite renderer component. So there's a bunch of sprite components, but we just want the renderer because that's what draws the image to the screen. What's up?
You zoom in the render visually.
Yes, there is. Like, I know there's a shortcut. For Mac, it's like on the trackpad, you just zoom in. How you do scroll up and down. I think scrolling up and down on your computer is how you would zoom in and out. So my player character is huge, so I'm actually just gonna make him smaller. And I'm just modifying the scale. Okay, but here's my player model, right? And my particle, can you go away? Okay. So here's my player, quote unquote, right? And you guys can put in a bunch of different images and stuff. You can change the color so that it's evil Kirby. Yeah, I'm gonna make it evil Kirby actually. But you can play around with it if you want. But we're gonna get into simple scripting. So I'm gonna go back to my assets folder and create a folder called scripts. And I know we'll only have one for this workshop, but it's just good practice to do that. And then you add a C# script, which is right under your folder little tab. So you create a C# script. I'm gonna call it player. So you name your scripts typically the object that they will be attached to, or like the name of the class. So I called it player. See, why is it doing that? That's the downside to Unity. It's compiling scripts. What are we compiling? All right, everybody create a script. So you can.
Assets. Okay, so we do a folder called scripts.
Yeah, and you can just right click, or you click the little plus button when you're in your folder.
Create and
C# script.
okay, here we go.
Awesome. All right, so you should theoretically be able to just double click on the script. All right, go away. Go away. Okay, double click on the script, and it'll open up Visual Studio for you. And it'll take a little second to open it up. Okay. So, it might take a second, because mine was like already opened before. But everybody was able to open their script, yes? So, this is the script that is default for every single class. So we'll go line by line. So the first 3 lines are your import statements. These are using the libraries, right? So if you want all your fancy autofill, fancy Unity methods and functions, you should leave those there. I guess if they're grayed out like the first 2, you can get rid of them, but those are like your lists and stuff for the first 2. So those are all the Unity engine things. Then we have this line 5, public class player : mono behavior. So what this is saying, we're creating a new class, and we typically only have one class per script. So the name of our script matches the name of the class, right? So capital P player. If I want to change my class, like let's say I change this to be player Bob, I need to change my script name to match my class name. Just a heads up. But it's public so that Unity can look at the script. And then the : mono behavior is inheritance. So there's a class inside of Unity called mono behavior. And these two functions, for example, start and update, are actually mono behavior functions. And so essentially, your any script that you create will typically, unless you want it to, will typically inherit stuff from mono behavior. Okay. And then these two, with a bunch of other methods, are from mono behavior and also the Unity engine. So these two lovely comments tell you what they do. So start, and you can also hover over it, right? If you installed everything correctly, hopefully this little thing pops up and it'll be much bigger for you guys. But start is called when the object is created within your scene, which is also when you first load up your scene. So if right now I have my player in my scene, but in case I spawn a new player, the start will be called. So anything I put in that method will run basically once upon creation. And update is called once per frame. Okay? So super simple. So I want you guys to kind of understand how this kind of works we will use a debug statement. Also, I will demonstrate how the console tab works, but we will do debug log, and then I'll create a line that says start called and then update called, right? So debug.log is saying, hey, log this debug. So this will only affect when you play test your game. It won't affect when you create like a full version of your game. So I'm just gonna say that start was called and that update was called, okay? And then don't forget to save your script, Control S, Command S. You go back to Unity, it'll recompile the scripts and you have to wait for it to do that. And then it's good. And then to run your script, also sorry, if anybody didn't catch that, it's just these debug.log. Okay. And to run your script, well, never mind. Actually, let's do this. I run my game, and then I expect console output, but there's nothing there. Can anybody tell me why nothing happened? Anybody have a guess? It's because I mentioned it very briefly before. Scripts are like components, right? So if we don't attach a component to our player or our game object, they won't do anything, right? So very simple. You can either add component and then look up script, new script, I guess. Don't do that. But my perfect preference is you just drag and drop it right here, right? So you take it from your assets, you make sure you have your object selected, and then you just drag and drop it, and boom, it's right there. See player script, and it's checked off, which means it's attached, right? So now when I run my game, I'm going to pause it real quick, but you can pause the game and then resume, which is very convenient. The reason why I pause is because I want to show you guys this output here. So this is what the console tab is for. So anytime you want to, as programmers, debug your code, be like, why is this not working? You're going to be looking at this a whole lot. So as you see, maybe it's hard to see, but start was called at the very beginning, right? I can't scroll up more than this. And then it's calling update every single frame. And it depends on your machine. So obviously if you play if let's say you have like an Android game, 60 FPS, 60 frames per second, this function is called 60 times in 1 second. But if you have a very low performing game, it's very small size, really efficient, and your computer's really fast, this might run 1,000 times a frame, right? So that's why there's so many of these update called statements. So your update function is going to be somewhat kind of like your game loop, right? So because any games are just run infinitely, so your update is called, and that's where you're going to be doing a lot of checks and stuff like that. one thing I want to point out as well with the play and pause is, let's say I play the game, right? And then I go over to my hierarchy and I want to delete this guy. I say, oops. Actually, let's see. I delete that one. So that Kirby is gone. But then I unpress my play button and he's back, like a tumor. So I just want to point out that any changes you make while you're playing your game, typically, unless you force it to, which is not the norm, any changes you make while you're playing or play testing your game will be undone when you stop playing. So that can be great if you want to, change a whole bunch of stuff without really it leaving an effect. But it's not great if you accidentally forget that you're playtesting your game and you do a whole lot of cool things and cool developments and you're like, oh wait, I was playing my game, and then you press play and then everything disappears, and then it gets snapped away. So just make sure that this is, you'll notice over time the editor dims a little bit, so you'll kind of get used to it as you play, as you use the editor more. But I've seen it happen before. It's really sad. So going back to our script, we're going to make this a little bit more interesting. Any questions so far, by the way, about anything? Okay, I know absolute basics, if you've programmed before, very simple, but that's how we take it nice and slow. So what we'll do is, so that there's some checks that happen, basically input. We're going to do some simple input, right? Let's see what the code here is. So I'm going to just comment these out, and you can have them there if you want. For now, let's see what this code does. Okay, so we'll be doing some simple input checking and moving the player very rudimentary, right? So there's like better ways to do it, but we're starting off with basics, so we'll do it very, very simply. The way to check for input is a nice if statement, right? So again, remember, update happens a gazillion times a second, so you don't want just to be like, hey, do this thing, because then it'll run forever. So most of the time in your update, you'll have a bunch of checks. So we're going to do if, right, and then something within that. So what we're going to do is if your input, which is a library, but get key down, right? So get key down is only when you press it down, because if you do get key, that's just saying if it's being pressed in this current frame, so that will count for if you're holding the key. So and also sometimes for you might feel like you're pressing instantly, but that's like 10 frames, and so maybe something will disappear. So we'll do get key down. There's also get key up if you want to play around with that. But then we do key code dot, for example, let's do A. So I'm going to do simple WASD kind of mechanics. And then here I'm going to just add the other one, right? Input, get key, key down, key code D, right? And what I want to do is to just simply move the position of my character. The neat thing is that this script, we attached it to the object, right? I remember as a component. And so you can, with how these Unity scripts work, is they kind of are inherently attached, and so you just can modify things directly without having to get like some sort of reference for it or like a pointer to it. So for example, there's a thing called like transform, and it's lowercase t, right? And this transform refers to this transform component, right? So in your code, you can access all of the components of your object that your script is attached to, right? The transform, it's like already fetched for you. You can fetch the other ones, which we can go over in future workshops, but the transform is nice because every game object has one. So what we want to do is just change the position of it, right? So for example, see here, there's position, rotation, and scale are like the three properties they have. So we could do transform dot, and you can see a bunch of stuff shows up, right? Like our rotation, position, and scale. I think it's called local scale. Yeah, local scale. We want to change position. So position, boom. And then there's a couple different ways to do it, right? Essentially, we just want it to set it to a new vector of 3 values, right? And what I mean by vector is that this is an x, y, and z coordinate, right? The z will leave default to 0, but we still have to set it to something. So we want to give it a new position. But we would like to set it based on an old position, right? Because we kind of want to move our character. So what I'm going to do is take the old position and I'm going to add a new vector to it. Because vector addition. And I'm going to add some things. So if I'm pressing A, I'm moving to the left, so I'm going to have some negative number. And I'm going to just do nothing for the 0 or the y component. So I'm not going to move up or down. And for now, I'm just going to do -1, right? Which I'll let you know what -1 means. But then I'll do the same thing for D, which you can also do this plus equals 1, 0, 0. Yeah, so this plus equals is like shorthand for take my item and add something to it and then save it back in my original item. And then new is the keyword for creating like a new instance of this class, which is a vector3. So vector3 is a Unity class, right? So it's not one that we're creating, it's one that Unity provided for us, and it's just 3 numbers, x, y, z, typically. So what does the 1 and -1 mean in this case? It actually refers to, because, units, you got to be careful. It refers to this grid in these units. So it's like this. See how it's like, for example, my current position is -0.182 something. Like, it's just an arbitrary value. I can put it to 0. Oh, that's the other one. Right? This one's at 4.8, so I can make it go to 0 and then 0. Right? And then so if it goes to 1, see how the center of the Kirby is now snapped to the next grid point. And so what our code does is it just kind of moves the Kirby or the player along this grid and just kind of snaps them to that place. So if I play my game so far, my Kirby, oh yeah. Oh, let me get rid of this guy. Die. All right, there we go.
Wait, you did not add the script.
What do you mean?
You didn't add the script.
I didn't. Did I do the wrong one? Yeah, I deleted the wrong Kirby. Okay. Why does it not work? Continuous movement? That would be with a rigid body and 2D physics, which is like a component, which is the way to do it usually, but that's like getting into fetching components and stuff, and so we'll probably cover that like next workshop. This is not working most likely because of key code. I've had issues with this. New vector. So this probably might work for some of you if you're on Windows. Because I'm trying to make it simple for like the purpose of the workshop, but then there's like just this is not really the way you do it. So let's see. I think it's input. Yeah. Okay. Let me try this. Right. Maybe I also just didn't save my script. Because basically there's the actual key values on your keyboard. So that's what the key code refers to. But let's say what I talked before is that, oh, it's gone. What I talked before is that Unity's cross-platform. So if you're saying get the A key, that doesn't exist on an Xbox. So that's why you have these axes. Yeah, this actually is fine. So if this code doesn't work for you guys, if you try, then try this instead. So essentially you do input instead of get key down, you get the axis, the horizontal axis. There's a horizontal axis and a vertical axis, which is the two most common input methods. What's up?
Just like.
Oh. And basically the reason why I check if it's less than 0 is because it'll be negative if you're going left and positive if you're going right. And for vertical, it'll be positive if you're going up or negative if you're going down. So the code that I'm doing is the same, it's just the check is different. So if I want to do this guy for my moving to the right, I would just change this to be get access horizontal again, greater than 0, so if it's positive. So if this code doesn't work for you, some of you guys, try this one. Then it definitely will. Although I believe your character will probably fly off the screen, which we will fix. Because I think the access is similar to holding the key and not just when you press it. So it's just kind of like, yeah, it's just, which we can modify right now by having a field with our speed. So any questions about this? Because I know I just jumped from this to this because this one didn't work for me. But this should work on any computer, okay? So any questions about this code? What's up?
So vector 3 refers to the x-axis?
Vector 3 is technically just a set of numbers. Like, you know, like a vector in math?
Yeah.
Like if you have like a vector that's pointed this way, you have your x component and your y component. Considering we're working in 3D space, we have a 3D vector. So it has a x component, a y component, and some z component. And so vector 3 just refers to this is x, this is y, and then this is z. The reason why I'm adding a vector 3 is because the position, if you can see really small, the position is a vector 3. So if I want to modify my position, I add a vector or subtract a vector, right? It's just adding a number. What this is saying is, like, let's say my position is like 2, 4, 0. Then this is saying, oh, take 2, 4, 0 and add negative 1, 0, 0, right? And then so we get 1, 4, 0. It's just kind of like coordinate points in a way. So like, it's just kind of like math. Unfortunately, that's game development. Lots of vectors and maybe matrices, depending on how complex you get. But trigonometry for sure, like you cosine, sine, tangent stuff. Because if you want to like figure out which way your character is going, you need to figure out the angle, right? But does this code make sense? So this plus equals is shorthand for equals plus here. But does that make sense as to like this is just adding or subtracting 1, and this is adding 1 to the x component, which is, you know, makes sense because we're trying to move left and right. Right? Awesome. So my character is moving way too fast because I'm moving 1 unit every single frame that I'm holding the key down, which is really fast. So I'm going to create a variable called speed, and instead of doing -1, I'm going to do negative speed. So that's a class variable. So if this is kind of getting into, so these are functions or methods technically. So if you have programming knowledge in Python or something, these are called by Unity. But in object-oriented programming, you have your instance variables, which are, or called fields sometimes as well. Those are basically specific to each class and each instance of your class. I'm going to create one called speed. I don't know. Whatever. I'm gonna make it. I'm gonna make it a float, which is a floating point, which is a decimal, basically. It's just a decimal. I'm gonna call it speed. By default, these are, I believe they're private. And if you want to make sure, you can just make it private. And then I'm gonna set it to 0.05, so it's pretty slow. And it's a little quirk in Unity, and I think also in some other languages. You just have to add f at the end to tell it that this is a floating point, because otherwise it'll be like, this is a double. You're giving me a double, and I want a floating point. So you're like, this is a floating point, and you just put f at the end. So if it yells at you, just make sure you add the f. But then, instead of having this -1, I'm just going to put negative speed and positive speed. So now, instead of moving 1 unit, like fully 1 unit every single frame, I'm holding my thing down. Here. There we go. That's the code. I'm going to move 0.05 units, so a lot smaller. And as you can see, like, it's pretty rudimentary. Again, I want this to be like a very simple workshop to ease into it. So we're just changing the position manually, right? Which is not the ideal way to do it. And we will kind of go over the ideal way to do it that's like more physics-based later on. But now you should hopefully move back and forth a lot less fast. Yeah? Have people, does this work for folks? You can move back and forth?
How do you select the camera again?
For which, you select it in just the left side of your hierarchy on the left. If you want to like change your background color, you can do that. Okay, I'm just gonna walk around real quick, and then and I want you guys to try on your own to do this for moving up and down with W and S. And the hint is you're gonna do get axis vertical, but it's gonna be basically the same. Okay, so I want you guys to try and move your character up and down as well, and then we can get into some other little coding things. But we're almost out of time, so.
What's the spacebar key code?
So the key code, the actual key code should be should be space. But you can actually check your axes of movement. I think it's in project settings. Or input settings. Oh, there we go. Okay, so we do, okay. Yeah, so to find all your axes, if you want to play around with them, you go edit project settings, and then input manager. And then you have this little drop down called axes. This is where you can find all of them. So horizontal, vertical. I think space is jump. So see, you can open up jump. So you, for example, the reason you can just do directly space, but if you like port it to Android, like what does that mean? Or Xbox, like what does that mean? So there's a jump one that has space as a positive button, and then a bunch of other ones as well. So like your joy number, your whatever. So this is kind of like the better way to do it. So when you want to jump, for example, you would use or press space to do something. You would check if your jump axis is happening. There's also like submit. There's another jump. There's cancel. So you can kind of use these guys. But I think if you want to, you can try doing key codes, but it depends on if your computer, if the key code will work or not. Because mine doesn't work for some reason.
I think you wrote it wrong.
You think I wrote it wrong? I just wrote what Mert wrote. Because I remember trying to do this before with key codes. Because I know there's key code space. I know that one exists. It doesn't work sometimes. It's like my Mac, I think. My Mac. Okay, let me go around. Alright, one last thing with these axes is if you notice that your character still moves after you let go, you can actually, instead of using get access, you can use get access raw, which basically gets rid of the automatic tamper, I forget the word, tamper? It does for you. So just if you're pressing it or not. Again, take a look at the key code stuff. I think it's machine dependent, or maybe I'm just doing it wrong. Because that's what Mert did, and it looks like for Mert it worked, and for me it didn't. I guess one last thing you can kind of code, just to kind of give you guys a little something spicy, I don't know, interesting to work on, and then we'll get out of here, is what I talked before with these components that we have transform, but for example, let's say my Kirby player has the sprite render component, and let's say I want to mess around with my sprite render component. There's basically a nice easy setup of doing that where you declare the component you want to play around with as a field, and the type of it would be the name of the component. So I'm gonna call it SPR for sprite. You could probably call it something better, but the type of it is sprite render. So it's not a flow or an int like how you have in C. So sprite render is a specific type for Unity. But the typical layout is I want to mess around with my sprite render, like let's say my color, for example. So I have a field, then inside of start, which is called for the very first time, I'm gonna get that component. And the way you do that is get component, and then it's interesting, you have the type, right? Because you can overload it with various types, and then the actual like call. So here I'm gonna put sprite render. And then the actual, so like in terms of coding, you have your parentheses that actually calls the function. There's no arguments, so I just have to add that at the end. But the little brackets tell me, I tell Unity which component I want to yoink, right? So I do that once inside of start, because when I have a field, this is empty at the very beginning. And then now I actually have access to the component, and now I can play around with it. So one thing that we can do is, for example, inside of our update method is if, let's say we're moving our position around, right? So let's say if our position, or let's say, for example, my X position, right? Because my code just works, my character moves back and forth, left and right. So if my position is less than 0, so if it's negative, let's do that my color is, let's see, color dot, I'm going to just use a pre-made color, red. I guess my Kirby's already red. Yeah, he'll be mad when it's negative. Otherwise, my sprite color is gonna be, I wonder if there's a way to do my own color. I'm gonna make him green when he's positive. Oh, if you want to do a custom color, maybe you can do, maybe I'm lying. Let's just try this. There's preset colors. I think maybe you could do new color. Like, yeah. So if you want like a custom color, you could do that. So I'm gonna make it still red. So I'm gonna just make these 100 because it's RGB, red, green, blue. So I'm gonna still make it red, but that's like if you want to play around with it. These are decimals from 0 to 1, right? So if you want a specific color, you can like look it up online and see what the values are. But we fetched this component, and then I'm going to change the color based on my position, and theoretically it should update and do that dynamically in the code. See? So very evil, and then he's happy. So if he's hungry, and then he's not hungry. So it's just something to play around with. But that's kind of like a basic idea of fetch the component, do something with the component that allows your scripts to be very powerful, right? So obviously you could do so many other things, so many other components you can add, do lots of other if statements and checks to do stuff with your code. But I think that's all about I want to cover. So again, it's absolute basics. So if this interests you, we did a little bit of scripting, we did a little bit of introduction. Here I can zoom out. That's our code there if you want to refer to it. Oh, I guess the one last thing with the slides. Where are my slides? Boom. All right. So I think the one last thing is on the slides I have this cool diagram I'll share the slides with you guys afterwards and the recording as well. I'm recording this. This is a cool little diagram if you want to refer to it. And then there's some useful links, which you can click on these in the slideshow once you have access to it, but you can also look it up. If you want to learn in your free time, for example, the scripting documentation is useful if you want to look stuff up. And I personally recommend the Unity Pathways. You could just look it up online. Just look up Unity Pathways. So this is really great tutorials made by Unity about how to use Unity. Because a lot of game development is sadly kind of done in your free time. Like, we try our best, but I don't think it's possible for us to teach every single thing because Unity is really large. And then that's it from me. If you guys could leave some feedback, I'd appreciate it, even if you had a great time, because then we know what we did good, and if you had a bad time, then we know what we did bad. It's anonymous, so we're not going to come hunt you down. I'll just cry a little bit, but no, it's okay. And then if you're not in the listserv or the Discord already, you can join us. And then the next workshop is going to be the same time next week in the same room, actually. So if you're interested, we'll continue still building on the basics, building on what we talked about today, but hopefully doing some more advanced stuff, and maybe talking a little bit more about scripting and kind of providing resources on scripting for folks that don't have too much programming experience. But that's all from me. So thank you for coming, and I don't want you to keep you late. It's already 9 o'clock. So yeah, if you have any questions, you can stick around afterwards, but that's all from me. And yeah, thanks for coming. I hope you guys had fun.